Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to the Neurosurgical case room. We are starting with the anatomy of temporal lobe today. It's going to be a brief session because I have a prior commitment, but I did not want to miss another session since we did not do anything last week. But let's make sure that we utilize whatever time we could have today. So let's begin. We are going to do the location and the boundaries. Please mute yourself. I think all the regular attendees, I think they would be pretty sure by this point that they would need to mute themselves until unless they have to ask any questions. So we start with the location and the boundaries. Since we have done Sylvian fissure, we get done with some part of the temporal lobe anatomy, and then we will proceed for Sylvian fissure splitting, probably next week. So we know by this point that the temporal lobe sits in the middle cranial fossa, and it lies inferior to the lateral fissure. Superiorly, the boundary is going to be the Sylvian fissure or the lateral fissure, which separates it from the frontal and the parietal lobes. We have done Sylvian fissure in very detail, so I'm very sure that you are all very clear on it now. Posteriorly, there is no clear boundary. It's an imaginary line that is drawn from pre-occipital notch to the parieto-occipital sulcus. Inferiorly, we have the middle cranial fossa floor and tentorium cerebelli if we go slightly towards the medial side. Medially, since tentorium is there, so the incisura tentorium is also going to be there. And once we are talking about the tentorial incisura, we would assume that this is going to be critically close to cranial nerve 3, brainstem. Along with that, the cerebral peduncles and the PCA, the PCOM, all the anatomy that we discussed in yesterday's session as well. So the best thing about the anatomy, which is probably the worst as well, is that you cannot separate the structures and you cannot do individual anatomy. For you to understand one region's anatomy, you will have to have some idea of the other region. So anybody who has attended yesterday's session, they would know what I am talking about. But we will come to it later on. This is the illustrated version. It's very easy to understand. You have the Sylvian fissure here. This is the posterior ramus of the Sylvian fissure. Then this is the superior temporal sulcus, and this is the inferior temporal sulcus. We have two sulci, two main sulci, and three gyri on the lateral surface. This is the lateral surface. So the first sulcus is, excuse me, the first sulcus is the superior temporal sulcus, and then the second is the inferior temporal sulcus. In between them, we have the superior temporal gyrus, which is green color coded here. And then we have the middle temporal gyrus, and then we have the inferior temporal gyrus. The inferior temporal gyrus starts on the lateral surface, but it also goes on the inferior-most surface as well, and it is continued on the inferior surface of the brain. So this is also the portion which is in contact with the middle cranial fossa. Let's move on. This is the medial and the inferior side of the brain, and you would see how intricate the anatomy is. Let me draw. This is the inferior temporal sulcus right here. And what do you see? Which structure is this?
Yes.
Uncus. So this is, which gyrus is going to be this? What gyrus is this?
Medial gyrus.
This is the parahippocampal gyrus, right? And in between the inferior temporal gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus, there is another gyrus, which is this one.
Parahippocampus.
Sorry?
Hippocampus.
No. This is the parahippocampal gyrus or the hippocampal gyrus. Okay, we will come back to it later on in the presentation. It's not a commonly known gyrus, so that's okay if you don't know.
For
Sorry?
fusiform gyrus.
That's right. Who is this? This is fusiform gyrus. It sits between the parahippocampal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus. We need to see this as well. We have the preoccipital notch, which is a notch visible, and then this is the parieto-occipital sulcus that you can see. So we draw this imaginary line. It's not an actual sulcus on the brain. It's an imaginary line where on the dissections, the anatomists and the researchers have found that the temporal lobe boundaries end and the occipital lobe boundaries start. So it is an arbitrary or an imaginary line between the preoccipital notch and the parieto-occipital sulcus. So this is the parieto-occipital sulcus marked in red. The preoccipital notch is also marked in red. And this is the purple line. This is where the temporal lobe ends. On the lateral surface of the brain, it's relatively harder to distinguish. On the medial surface, we can still make a clear distinction. We move. You can see the Sylvian fissure, which is very wide here, and you can see the superior temporal sulcus going around here. And then we have this inferior temporal sulcus somewhere here. It's not visible. Please, Dr. IB, do not draw on my screen. It's inconsistent, but you can see it. And then the gyri, they are very easily visible. The superior temporal gyrus, this is the middle temporal gyrus, and this is the inferior temporal gyrus. This region is the temporal tip. And later on, we are also going to discuss the planum polar and the planum temporal. Dr. IB Novoko, please do not draw on my screen. So this image is from Roton, and I'm sure you all have taken at least a look at the Roton after the Sylvian fissure anatomy. It's a beautiful book, and I highly recommend it to everyone. You can see that this is the posterior stem of the Sylvian fissure. These are the rami that we have discussed very thoroughly yesterday. In fact, this is the ramus. This is the ramus. And here is the middle cranial fossa, which is housing the temporal lobe beautifully. You can see the superior temporal gyrus, you can see the middle temporal gyrus, and you can also see that the inferior temporal gyrus starts on the lateral surface, but then later on, it curves under the temporal lobe and continues on the middle cranial fossa. Let's move. This is a coronal section, and it's interesting because you can see a lot of interesting structures here. You can see, let's do a very brief review of the Sylvian as well. I want to see how much all of you have retained. So what is this surface? Do we have any volunteer? Okay, I'm going to draw both parts. What is this yellow part?
Opercular?
That's right. This is the opercular part of the operculo-insular portion of Sylvian. And then the red one?
Circular surface.
Insular. This is the insular part. It's the circular sulcus and the insular segment of the Sylvian fissure. If we talk about the sulcus, then the sulcus is indeed circular sulcus. If we talk about the CS of a space between them, the arachnoidal space, then that is the insular portion of the Sylvian fissure. So this entire thing that I highlighted, both the red and the yellow, this is the continuation of the operculo-insular segment of the Sylvian fissure. Be clear? This one is the superior limb, and this one is the inferior limb, right? The superior limb was between the frontal and the insular surface, or sometimes parietal and the insular surface. The inferior limb is between the temporal and the inferior insular surface. Let me clear this all so that we can come to the temporal lobe anatomy. So you can see that the superior temporal gyrus is in direct communication with the Sylvian fissure, and then it goes in. Then we have the middle temporal gyrus. If I had taken this cornal section at another level, it's visible, not very nicely visible, but it is still visible. What is this structure? The orange colored.
Temporal horn.
This is temporal horn. So middle temporal gyrus, if we go straight through it, we can reach the temporal horn. So it is one of the corridors. Also, middle temporal gyrus is relatively safe if you end up making a small corticectomy and you want to approach this region. Clear this. Then we have the inferior temporal gyrus. Then we have the fusiform gyrus. Can someone comment on the function of the fusiform gyrus? I write the answers here on the screen. This is the region where words are recognized, where faces are recognized. So the facial recognition and the word recognition is heavily based in fusiform gyrus. The temporal lobe has a lot of functions, mostly concerning with memory, language. And when I say language, it means the comprehension and the recognition, recognizing the visual aids, whatever words we are reading, understanding it, making connections between different things, making connections between names and faces. So it's big on the comprehension and the language and the memory. Fusiform gyrus is just one small part of this huge circuit, but it is important for the facial recognition and for the word recognition. Then we have the parahippocampal gyrus, which is associated with memory. And right in the depths of it, we see the hippocampus and the amygdala. And the medial most portion of the amygdala is called, what is the medial most portion here? You all know it. It's uncus. Yes, that's right. It's uncus. We are going to see the images ahead, and you will notice how the uncus, when we take the cortex away, beneath it lie the amygdala and the hippocampus. Are we clear till here?
Yes, ma'am.
So this is a very interesting picture because you see a lot of other structures here. If we go down the insular surface, what is this structure somewhere here? I'm going to mark the structures and then can volunteer.
External capsule.
Yes, the red one is the red one is what?
External capsule.
The red one is extreme capsule.
Extreme. Yeah, okay. Extreme capsule.
And what is the orange one?
Claustrum, I think. External.
Claustrum. Claustrum is a small area of gray matter which is trapped between two white matters. And what are those two white matters? Extreme capsule and the external capsule. So the green one is the external capsule. The red one is the extreme capsule. Orange is the claustrum. And when we go deep, we find the basal ganglia. Clear this? So while we are at temporal lobe, we also did a bit of basal ganglia as well, because you cannot understand anatomy alone. So this is an illustration which is a lot easier to understand. You can see the temporal fold here. You can also see the uncus here, which is labeled entorhinal cortex, because it is heavily involved in the olfaction, etc., etc. Then we have the parahippocampal gyrus. Then we have the fusiform gyrus, which is color-coded blue. And then we have the inferior temporal gyrus. Somewhere around here, we have the preoccipital notch. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. So this is the arbitrary line. So far, all good. This is another coronal section. And this also depicts the relationship of hippocampus and the temporal horn with the middle temporal gyrus. You can see this is the middle temporal gyrus here. And if we go via a small cortisectomy here, assuming that there is a lesion in this temporal horn, we make a small cortisectomy. And if we go directly, we are going to find the temporal horn. Right around it, there are going to be optic radiations. What are these radiations called?
Meyer's loop.
Meyer's
That's
loop.
right, Meyer's loop. What happens if we damage this?
Superior
Quadrantal lobe, yeah, contralateral.
What is that called?
Pie in the sky.
Pie in the sky. That's right. So if we take it off, there is a pie in the sky kind of defect, which means that the vision is going to look like this. Is this right? Or this is right?
The second one.
Why?
Because
Both are
it will
right,
go to
madam.
the contralateral.
You did not ask me a very important question.
Oh, okay. Where is the lesion? Is it the right or left?
Where is the lesion?
Yeah. I mean, assuming on this image, we can't assume, but assuming if it's on the left, then the lesion should be on the right. I mean, the defect would be on the
Lower
right.
one. The
Contralateral.
lower one is correct, madam, I think.
The lower one is what?
The lower one is correct.
Why is the lower one correct?
Because it looks like the right eye, and the image which I assume looks like left-sided image.
Okay.
Left-sided temporal lobe.
If is you are saying that the lower one is the left-sided temporal lobe. Is that what you said?
No, I am saying that the image we are studying looks like the left side temporal lobe, and the image,
Okay.
the lesion should be, the eye should, affected eye should be the right one.
You're saying that the image we are looking at is the left temporal lobe, so the lower image is right. Is that what you said?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that's right. So
Thank you, ma'am.
if it is the right temporal lobe, then the upper defect is going to happen. If it is the left temporal lobe, then the lower defect is going to happen. There are trick questions like this. So before answering, always ask where the lesion is, because I did not give you the location of the lesion. Let's move on. I'm just making sure you guys stay awake. Anatomy can be boring to certain people. So, middle temporal gyrus, it lies between the superior and inferior temporal sulci. We already did that. Deep to middle temporal gyrus, we are going to find the temporal horn. But there was another important structure that I forgot to mention. Ambient and the crural cisterns are also located deep to it. So, if we are going deeper, you can see this region, the CSF and the crural cistern here as well. Crura is not, it's not nicely visible. Let me see if I have a better image. So before we go to the cisternal anatomy, let's go briefly over the gyri. We have the superior temporal gyrus. The main function is auditory processing and the vernix area. We know that. We have already discussed it during the Sylvian fissure session. Then we have the middle temporal gyrus. Middle temporal is between the superior and inferior temporal sulci. It is associated with the semantic memory and the language. You can sacrifice it. Patient will have minimal deficit, but it's a viable corridor. Then inferior temporal gyrus. It is also used for visual object recognition, facial processing, because it is in connection with the fusiform gyrus as well. So if you study different authors for anatomy, then a lot of authors have very different opinions regarding the location of vernix area. So there are people who say that only the superior temporal gyrus, this portion, is the vernix area, but then you will also find authors who will say that, what gyrus is this, by the way? This and this, what gyri are these?
Supramarginal and angular.
That's right. So this is
Okay.
supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus.
Angular.
So the modern theory says that parts of supramarginal gyrus, parts, not all of it, and parts of angular gyrus, and parts of the superior temporal gyrus, they are all vernix area, and it's difficult to pinpoint a certain area that okay, only a certain segment of superior temporal gyrus is going to be vernix. So there is this difference of opinion, but you should know that the region that we just discussed is the most widely accepted theory. Then let me clear this. There is another theory. There are people who believe that only the Heschel's gyrus has the primary auditory cortex. Then there is a segment of authors that believes that this region here in the superior temporal gyrus also includes the primary auditory cortex. So the wider belief is that both the parts of Heschel's gyri, we are going to do what Heschel's gyri are. Heschel's gyri and the superior temporal gyrus both include some portion of the auditory cortex, the primary auditory cortex. Am I clear so far?
Yes.
Okay. So once we open the Sylvian fissure, we open it wide for our dissection, not during surgery, for our dissection. Then the superior temporal area is going to contain 2 or 3 very important structures. Starting from anterior, we are going to find planum polar. After planum polar, we are going to find Heschel's gyri. After Heschel's gyri, we are going to find the planum temporal. And around the planum polar, there's a very important structure that runs, that is MCA. Clear this? So Heschel's gyri are usually 1 to 2. They are variable. The first Heschel's gyrus is usually the primary auditory cortex. Planum temporal is posterior to the Heschel's gyrus. Planum polar is anterior to the Heschel's gyrus. Even though they sound similar, their function is different. Their location is also different. Planum polar is something you will find very anterior to the Heschel's, around the temporal tip. Planum temporal is going to be posterior to the Heschel's gyrus, and it also correlates, the size of it correlates with the language dominance. I'll show you a picture. So this is how the Heschel's gyrus is going to look. Once we go through the Sylvian fissure, you're going to see this prominent gyrus on this surface here, and that is Heschel's gyrus. So before we dive into the anatomy, which is which lobe? Which is this lobe? This one?
Axial.
Is it temporal lobe or is it frontal lobe?
Frontal.
Frontal lobe, right? No confusions. Easy peasy. Which is this? This is temporal lobe. Why do they look alike? They look alike because they behave like 1/4 of the walnuts. This is not a half. A half is a hemisphere. You have separated the half in 2 quarters. So this is the frontal lobe. What they have done is they have dissected the temporal lobe away from here. This is the temporal stem. Now, what is temporal stem? Anyone? Temporal stem is nothing but a collection of white matter fibers. It's a band that connects the temporal lobe with the frontal lobe, with the thalamus as well. So what they have done is they have dissected right at the base so that the temporal stem is cut. And what you see on this side is the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. You can see the opercular gyri. You can see the Sylvian fissure, which is going around here. You can also see the anterior perforated substance and pulvinar of the thalamus. Somewhere around here, there is going to be the cerebral peduncle as well. This is the same section that they cut off from the temporal stem. And what you see here is the superior surface of the temporal lobe. Let me write it. This is the superior surface. Here, this is the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. Does it make sense?
Yes.
They are the same hemispheres. We have just dissected them right at the stem and we have separated them far away. So, yes, you can see the planum polar. Somebody asked me this question yesterday and I have never thought about it this way. What happens is MCA is running right here. So since MCA is here, if you're planning to take planum polar away for the anterior temporal lobectomy, you cannot take the MCA along. You have to protect the arachnoidal layers of the MCA, and then you also have to leave a small layer of pia matter. So you go under the pia and you perform a subpial resection to take out the planum polar. Let me clear all of this. You can see the planum polar here anteriorly and temporal stem where it was cut. And then you can see the Heschel's gyri here. And posterior to Heschel's gyri, you see the planum temporal. Is it clear now? This is the planum polar. The pink region is planum temporal. And in between, this orange thing is the Heschel's gyrus. And the first Heschel's gyrus is the primary auditory cortex. Clear all of it. Slightly deeper, what do you see here? This is the temporal horn along with its choroid plexus. And then posteriorly, we also see the atrium here. Is it clear?
Yes.
Okay, let's
Yes.
move on. So temporal stem connects the temporal lobe to frontal lobe and the thalamus. It's composed of white matter tracts. There are a lot of other tracts as well. But for the sake of this session's discussion, inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus and the uncinate fasciculus as well. Mears loop sometimes also gives some radiations into the temporal stem. Then we have the parahippocampal gyrus, which wraps around the hippocampus medially. Anterior end curves into the uncus. What we see on the medialmost surface, probably the earliest anatomical structure that we learn. And the significance is that it can compress the cranial nerve 3 and cause the classic blown pupil. You can now see the inferior most surface of the brain. And this here is the parahippocampal gyrus. This is the fusiform gyrus. This is the inferior temporal gyrus. And medially, we have the uncus. And now you can also see that how close the crura and how close the crural cistern is. This is the crura. This is the base of the cerebral peduncle. Oh, okay, it's labeled here as well. This region is the cerebral peduncle. So around it, we are also going to have the crural cistern. And what cistern is here? Which cistern is going to be this? Ambient cistern.
Ambient.
That's right. And which cistern is going to be this?
Quadrigeminal.
Quadrigeminal. Quadrigeminal cistern. And which cistern is going to be here?
Interpeduncular.
Interpeduncular cistern. So all of these are connected and there is going to be tent here, right? We know this, that the tent goes around like this. So for that, you will have to imagine. Part of the temporal lobe is in communication with the tent. Never study anatomy in isolation. You would have to imagine rest of the structures that are not visible in that image. So somewhere around here, we are going to have the anterior clinoidal processes as well on the base of the skull, where the tent is going to get attached. And this is where the incisura of the tent is. And there are a lot of important structures. We have PCOM here. We have PCA running here. Can someone tell me why PCA gets these infarcts when there is raised ICP?
Because of the uncle herniation that compresses
Ankle
the
compression.
herniation that compresses the posterior artery that causing the same fit, irritable infect.
Your voice was not clear. So I'm not sure if what you said was right or wrong, either way. But
Actually, there will be a uncle herniation that compresses the posterior cerebral artery Because of that compression of posterior lateral, there is a PCA territory in fact will be there.
Okay.
Ipsilateral.
So if there is no uncal herniation, is it still going to have a PCA infarct? The what is the primary modus of the PCA infarction? Yes, uncal herniation can be one of the mechanisms, but what ends up happening is there's very narrow space somewhere around here. So if PCA crosses the tent and then runs on the superior surface, we all know this, right? PCA is the terminal most branch of the basilar artery. It
Yes, ma'am.
crosses the tent and then runs over the superior surface of the tent below the temporal lobe. So what ends up happening is if there is raised ICP, even if there's no uncal compression, PCA can get compressed because PCA is running right here. If you go and look at the PCA images, you will find it right here at the edge of the tent. So there is superior compression. Inferiorly, there is tent. Superiorly, there is temporal lobe. And what ends up happening is it can get compressed in between and patient can have the PCA territory infarct. For that, uncal herniation is not always necessary. Clear all of
Yes, ma'am.
this? Uncal herniation is going to affect cranial nerve 3. What is another vessel that is in close communication here? Which is also going backwards like this.
Superior cerebellar artery.
No,
Superior
posteriorly.
cerebellar.
PCOM.
PCOM. PCOM is going to go here. Okay. This is a beautiful dissection. You can see all the relevant structures now on the inferior surface. We have the parahippocampal gyrus. The green one is the fusiform gyrus. And you can see the uncus, which is the medialmost portion. You can also see the crura here. We have the crura here. And right here, we are going to have the crural cisterns. You can see the mammillary bodies, the optic tracts, the optic nerve. I think we have covered the inferior surface of the brain in quite detail in past few sessions. So this is a difference. I included it because a lot of people get confused between the polar and the temporal since they sound similar. Polar is anterior, in front of fascials. Temporal is posterior, behind the fascials. Polar is associated with acoustic processing. It is associated with music. This is where the music is perceived and processed. Whereas planum temporal is associated with the language comprehension, complex auditory processing. It's bigger in the dominant cortex. Okay, yes, and there is asymmetry, strongly left dominant. Usually the planum polar is right dominant. So the music side is the right brain. Then if there is any injury or if there is any lesion around the planum temporal, then dyslexia, schizophrenia, stuttering can happen. If there is any injury or if we take the planum polar out during anterior temporal lobectomy, patient can have social emotional disorders and they will lose the ability to perceive the music. So they will have auditory agnosia. You can see that they have retracted the frontal lobe superiorly and all the structures are visible now. The green region is the planum polar. The blue region is the Hassel's gyrus, and the yellow region is the planum temporal, whereas this entire thing is the superior temporal gyrus. And we know that the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus is more or less associated with vernix, whereas this brief region, the anterior, let me change the color. The anterior and part of the posterior superior temporal gyrus can handle the auditory processing. Hence, you can see that PT is very close. The planum temporal is close to the vernix area. So it is associated with language processing. And planum polar is associated with auditory area. So it is associated with the musical processing. Is that clear now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I think this was the last slide for today. So we continue this tomorrow, inshallah. Tomorrow we have the last session of the week since it's Thursday, and then we restart from Monday. Dr. Itzaz is sort of stuck somewhere this week. Let's see if we can have him for Sylvian splitting next week. Thank you so much, everyone. Let me know if we have any questions, any feedback, anything. Okay, someone is asking for the WhatsApp group link. I'm not sure how to send it here. If you found this session link on the you can take a look at the YouTube channel and leave me a message on the LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is linked there. Thank you so much, everyone. Does anyone have any other question?